Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Glad to be here, and I am really excited about what we are getting into today.
Yeah, me too. So I want you to imagine walking into a 19th century boardroom. You have these polished mahogany tables, the smell of expensive cigars, and a group of incredibly wealthy Wall Street bankers just sitting around waiting for the meeting to start.
Right, the absolute elite of the city.
Exactly. And sitting at the head of that table, the person actually giving them operational orders and leading the institution is a former teenage runaway and sex worker from the subcellars of New York City.
Which is just an incredible image.
It really is. Today, we are looking at how that completely impossible scenario became a reality. We are opening up a remarkable historical record, a book called Women Who Changed the Heart of the City by Delores T.
And the source material here is just fascinating. It is packed with historical excerpts, biographical sketches, and the actual foundational documents of the city rescue mission movement.
Right, covering from the 1800s straight through to the late 1900s. And our mission in this deep dive is to basically uncover the hidden mechanical history of urban redemption.
I like that phrasing.
Thanks. We are unpacking how a wildly diverse group of women, from runaways to blind senior citizens, from wealthy aristocrats to country school teachers, how they became the actual operational backbone and the literal beating heart of the global rescue mission movement.
And this is a history that completely upends our standard narrative.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like history always remembers the famous men.
Right.
We constantly hear about Dwight L. Moody packing massive auditoriums or Billy Sunday orchestrating these highly theatrical citywide crusades.
Yeah, we get a very sanitized top-down view of history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today, we're giving you the untold story. We are bypassing the pulpits to get to the dirt. We are looking at the women who actually ran the soup kitchens, who faced down armed criminals, and who built these institutions.
Well, and what is fascinating here is the pattern of proximity.
Proximity. Let's unpack that.
Right. So these women didn't just write checks. They didn't operate like a modern philanthropic board from the safety of a suburban parlor. They physically relocated.
Right.
Yeah, they moved themselves, and in many cases, their young families, directly into the absolute epicenter of the most dangerous, disease-ridden slums to practice what the author calls incarnational love.
Incarnational love. I love that. So let's trace the DNA of that proximity back to where it started. Because before looking at the explosive growth in America, we really must trace the movement to its roots in 1826 Glasgow.
Glasgow in the 1820s was rough. It was the bleeding edge of the Industrial Revolution.
Right, grinding poverty right next to massive factory web.
Exactly. And to understand the foundational DNA of this movement, we have to look at radical partnership. It starts with David Naismith.
David is so interesting because he is the complete opposite of the heroic founder archetype.
Oh, completely. He was an uneducated, sickly Scottish bookkeeper.
Right, just a low-level guy.
But he started the very first city mission in 1826. He would just go into the slums in his free time, visiting thieves and prostitutes.
But the spark in Glasgow doesn't become a global movement without infrastructure.
No, it absolutely does not.
And that is where Frances Hartridge comes in.
Frances changes everything. She was an independent English businesswoman.
Which in the 1820s is practically unheard of.
Exactly. She had her own money, her own autonomy. She sees David's vision and helps him raise money. She literally helped mail 2,000 letters globally to scale this idea.
Handwritten letters, right?
Hand addressed, yes. Think about the physical labor of that in 1826. So they get married in 1828.
Okay, and here's where it gets wild to me. The moment they marry, they embrace extreme poverty.
Right.
David becomes a general moral agent and start missions worldwide, London, Paris, America, Canada. But to afford the ship to America, Frances actually sells her personal furniture.
And travels across the Atlantic with their infant baby, David.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because if I look at this from a modern perspective,
it looks completely reckless.
It does. Why would a successful businesswoman marry a man who gives away all their money to the point where they couldn't even pay their basic bills? Is this romantic dedication or is this just madness?
Well, you have to remember the era. Women were completely relegated to the domestic sphere under the laws of coverture. A married woman's assets legally belong to her husband.
Which is terrifying.
It is. So for her to voluntarily surrender her wealth for this cause, she was making a massive psychological commitment. But why she did it is key. The sources paint this really sensory picture of their life.
Right, the smell.
Yes. David would come home smelling of the slums, the disease, the raw sewage, but children would run up to him in the alleys and grab his hands.
He wasn't afraid.
Not at all. And Frances found him, quote, more of a real man than any of the wealthy suitors she had before because of his raw courage. She was his intellectual and spiritual equal.
It's a total redefinition of value. But the physical toll was brutal. David dies at age 40.
And the medical intervention was horrific.
Yeah, the book details that he had some rapid disease, and they literally applied 24 leeches to his stomach.
It's just agonizing.
Yeah.
So Frances is left as a young widow with 5 children.
Right, fighting off total bitterness. But she keeps his legacy going.
She does. And the movement only survived because of female funding and logistical support from these groups, like the maternal associations and the young women's groups.
The logistics of it are brilliant, though. The Naismiths took a radical vow of poverty, but they also insisted on absolute local control.
Yes, this is crucial.
They intentionally left their own names off the organizing documents of the missions they started.
Which is the exact opposite of what you see today.
Right. Today, it's all about branding. But by leaving their names off, they set the template for modern, decentralized nonprofits. The locals had to take ownership.
It forced the community to step up. And that decentralized model is exactly what allowed the movement to adapt when it crossed the ocean to America.
Which perfectly transitions us from the philosophical origins in Scotland to the gritty, street-level application in New York City.
Right, moving from the respectable Naismiths to the actual streets.
Because the movement had to adapt. And it did that by allowing the rescued to actually become the rescuers. Let's talk about Maria and Jerry McCauley.
Oh, this is an incredible story.
So we are talking about the subsellers of New York. Maria Fahey was a runaway who became a prostitute in these literal underground unregulated caverns.
Just absolute rock bottom.
And Jerry was a river thief, an ex-con. During the Civil War, he was a bounty scammer. He would sign up for the Union Army, take the cash, desert, and do it again.
He was a predator, essentially.
Completely. But a city missionary named Henry Little relentlessly pursued Jerry. And there's this one specific moment.
The coat.
The coat, yes. Henry Little pawns his own thin old coat in the dead of winter just to give Jerry 50 cents so Jerry wouldn't have to return to crime on the river to survive that day.
And that action right there, that is incarnational love.
Right. It shatters Jerry's defenses.
Yeah.
It triggers this massive conversion for both Jerry and Maria. But they didn't just jump into leadership.
No, they actually separated. They stopped living together until they had proved their character, and they were legally married in 1872.
They built a foundation, and then they opened the Helping Hand for Men, which became the famous Water Street Mission.
And later the Cremorne-McCauley Mission, right in the heart of a violent red light district.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. When Jerry eventually dies from the toll his past took on his body, Maria takes over as superintendent.
She does.
And she is backed by incredibly wealthy men, like Alfred Smith Hatch, who was a Wall Street banker.
The president of the New York Stock Exchange, actually.
Wow. So I have to ask, how did a 19th century society, which we know was violently obsessed with female purity, how did they accept a former sex worker as the superintendent of a major institution over an all-male board?
It comes down to why the McCauley experiment was so effective in the first place. They had instant credibility.
Street credibility.
Exactly. Prior to this, you had middle-class clergy trying to preach in the slums, but there was this barrier of respectability that kept the poor away.
The poor felt judged.
Right. But when Maria testified, with tears in her eyes about her own sinful past in those very same cellars, she completely removed that barrier. She proved the distance could be crossed.
But the psychological weight she must have carried is staggering. I mean, she had to openly confess her past as a fallen woman to give others hope.
She sacrificed her own reputation and pride for decades.
Just ripping open her own trauma over and over. And they targeted the darkest corners on purpose, like the story of Happy Joe.
Right. Happy Joe wanders into a brothel, slightly drunk, and starts singing a hymn.
Just belting it out in the parlor.
And that gave Jerry and Maria the vision to plant the Cremorne Mission right in the absolute worst neighborhood they could find. They didn't run from the vice. They moved right into it.
So, having seen the destitute become leaders, we now look at the exact opposite end of the spectrum, because this movement demanded a massive leveling of society.
It really did.
Wealthy and educated women actually abandoned their comfort zones to join the front lines alongside women like Maria.
And you need that capital. A movement needs cultural credibility, but it also needs funding. Emma Whitmore is a perfect example of this.
Yes, Emma. She was a wealthy socialite.
Insanely wealthy. She and her husband, Sidney, visit Jerry McCauley's mission wearing these fancy heavy coats.
Which was probably just slum tourism, right?
Likely, yes. But they get in there, and the heat is sweltering, and they feel completely convicted of their useless lives.
Right.
So they physically remove their coats in the heat, which is this huge symbolic gesture. They convert, and Emma goes on to found the Door of Hope for prostitutes.
And she ran it fiercely. She famously took in a young woman named Vanjie, who was a dying morphine addict, against literally everyone's advice.
She ignored the respectable voices entirely. And speaking of abandoning comfort, Fannie J. Crosby is another major figure here.
The famous hymn writer.
Exactly. She wrote Rescue the Perishing, which is the anthem for the movement. She was blind and in her 60s already a massive celebrity.
But instead of retiring, she moves into a tenement.
Right into the slums. And she practiced what the text calls conversational evangelism.
Which is fascinating because of how she did it.
Yeah, she would go into the Bowery missions and actually sniff out the worst-smelling men in the room. The men who smelled so bad, everyone else was avoiding them.
And she would intentionally sit right next to them.
Just to talk to them so they wouldn't be totally isolated.
The relational equity there is incredible. She didn't preach at them. She sat with them, just like Clem Ellis White.
Clemen is another powerhouse, a country girl who gave up a medical career after visiting a Chinatown mission.
She preached with a bullhorn in Hell's Kitchen at night, but by day, she maintained her teaching job.
Which was so strategic. She knew she had to keep earning the respect of the working-class people she ministered to. If she didn't work a normal job, she'd lose that connection.
And she was operationally brilliant. She co-founded the International Union of Gospel Missions, the IUGM, in 1913.
She essentially unionized their charitable efforts. And by 1920, she made national headlines by becoming an ordained minister.
Which was a massive deal for women in ministry back then.
It was a radical shift in the late 19th century. This movement essentially created one of the first safe public spheres for female professional leadership and public speaking outside the traditional church hierarchy.
Okay, but I have to ask about this dynamic of wealthy women like Emma Whitmore going into the slums. Because today, we look at a socialite with diamond rings heading downtown and immediately think, oh, white savior complex.
Right, elitist tourism.
Exactly. So how did they avoid just being tourists handing out bread?
Well, the sources show they were acutely aware of that tension. There is this stark contrast described where Emma Whitmore is sitting at an exclusive tennis club looking at all her peers with their diamond rings.
And what happens?
She hears this internal whisper challenging her to look at her wealthy peers with the exact same unjudging eyes of Jesus as she would a person in the gutter.
Wow.
She realized the moral brokenness was universal. The rich just had velvet curtains to hide it, so they avoided the savior complex because they saw themselves as equals in need of the same grace.
That shifts the entire paradigm. But to be able to fully immerse themselves in such dangerous, time-consuming work, we have to look at their familial status.
This is a huge structural component.
Yeah, let's transition to the unique advantages of single women, and then the deep maternal drive of older women in the movement.
So, relying on 1 Corinthians 7, many of these women chose to stay unmarried for undivided devotion.
Right, avoiding the divided interests of a spouse.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it was also a legal strategy. Single women were able to cross social boundaries that married Victorian women couldn't.
Because of those coverture laws we talked about.
Exactly. A married woman needed her husband's permission, but a single woman had autonomy, like Anne Spellman.
Oh, Anne gave up her grandfather's massive wealth just to start the Missionary Workers Society.
And Mamie Caskey and Jenny Garanflo, they started the Grace and Hope missions in Baltimore with a grand total of $13 between them.
$13. It's wild. And then you have Annie Green in Australia, forming the Night Rescue Association. She was literally going down to the shipping docks at midnight to intercept young immigrant girls right off the boats before the traffickers could get them.
A respectable married woman could never wander the docks at midnight without a husband's permission or ruining her reputation. Single women had the mobility required.
But then on the flip side, you have the mothers of the mission.
Right, older women who weaponized their maternal energy.
Like Sarah Clark at the Pacific Garden Mission. She had no biological children, but she became mother to thousands of destitute men, including Mel Trotter.
Mel Trotter's story is crucial here. He was a severe alcoholic, a gambler, but his own biological mother, Emily, never stopped praying for him.
She refused to give up.
And eventually, he wanders into the mission and meets Mother Clark, whose maternal care breaks down his defenses. He gets rescued and goes on to found 67 different rescue missions himself.
Think about the psychological impact of that title, Mother, in these missions.
It's massive.
These are men cast out of society. A traditional fiery preacher screaming at them just makes them defensive. But the unconditional, non-judgmental love of a maternal figure slips right under their defenses.
It breaks down walls that theology alone couldn't touch.
There's this visceral image in the text. Mel Trotter remembers his mother Emily's twisted, arthritic hands, and he claims he never got so drunk that he couldn't feel her hand resting on his shoulder.
That phantom touch saved his life.
But I want to point out a quote from Dr. W.E. Paul. He notes that while 50 missions were operated by women, they were often just the invisible right hand.
Right, doing all the secretarial work, the counseling, the operational heavy lifting.
While the men sat on the boards and took all the official titles. So how do we analyze this historical gender dynamic? Were they just suppressed?
They were operating within a strict patriarchy, yes, but they were pragmatists. If the board wouldn't let a woman be director, she would take the title of matron and quietly run the entire operation anyway.
They cared more about the work than the credit. And that deep maternal love wasn't soft, it was fierce. Which brings us to where they waged this war.
Geographic reclamation.
Yes, taking back the turf. They didn't build shiny new churches in the suburbs. They strategically invaded and physically occupied the most notorious buildings of sin in their cities. Let's talk about Beulah Bulkley.
Oh, Kansas City. Her husband, Dave, decides to lease Madame Lovejoy's infamous brothel for their mission.
A building so corrupt, it had a literal trapdoor for smuggling illegal wine during police raids.
And Beulah is terrified. She cries, she argues against it.
Which, as a mother, is completely understandable. Who wants to raise a kid in a brothel?
But she eventually agrees. She moves her young daughter in, surrounded by ex-cons, and then she does something brilliant.
She befriends the competition next door.
Exactly. A 92-year-old madam named Annie Chambers. Beulah just brings her food and a Bible, treats her like a normal neighbor.
And it works. Annie converts and eventually donates her own $100,000 mansion to the mission.
The theological and psychological strategy here is profound. Turning a literal brothel or a beer garden into a sanctuary sends a visceral message to the community.
It says no place is beyond redemption.
Right. And therefore, no person is beyond redemption.
So what does this all mean for us today? I mean, it's like planting a flourishing garden inside a toxic waste dump.
Yeah.
But practically speaking, how do you raise a child in a brothel filled with recovering addicts without destroying your own family?
Well, consider the daily reality for Beulah. The text details her hosting a funeral for a prostitute's nameless baby right inside the former brothel's parlor.
That is just heartbreaking.
It is, and it forces us to ask how modern urban renewal, which is usually just bulldozing blighted areas, compares to this deeply human, spiritually driven reclamation.
Right. They shared the physical space of the trauma. And that suspenseful moment during the funeral. Yeah. Annie Chambers, the madam, is watching from her window next door.
She hears the sermon for the baby.
And it breaks her heart. She approaches Beulah, pulls a solid gold necklace from a trunk, and gives it to Beulah's little daughter.
That healing only happens because of the proximity.
We see that same geographic courage with Marie Sandvik and Doris Nye in Minneapolis.
Oh, Marie. She was an orphaned Norwegian immigrant.
She rents a cockroach-infested ex-tavern for $45.
And she faces incredible danger. She famously stared down a berserk soldier who was pointing a loaded gun right at her head.
And she just commands him to drop it, in Jesus' name.
And he does. The raw courage is just unbelievable.
It really is. But it begs the question, how did this 19th century movement survive the massive social upheavals of the 20th century? We're talking world wars, depressions, apartheid.
It survived through ultimate adaptability and mentorship.
Let's look at Maud Benton in L.A. She was a volunteer for 45 years, serving under 32 different superintendents.
Which takes serious diplomacy.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But during World War II, she adapts the mission to serve 2 million servicemen.
She was sitting there making handmade canvas money belts for soldiers going off to war.
She pivoted to meet the immediate crisis. Helen, Ma Sunday did the same thing.
Right. After her husband, Billy Sunday, died, she knelt by his body and literally prayed for a new job.
And she spent the next 20 years traveling the country as a speaker and encourager for missions.
She adapted her grief into a second act. And then you have Susan E. Benjamin in Cape Town, South Africa.
Operating under apartheid.
Exactly. The government literally bulldozes the mission building in District 6.
So what does she do? She just hosts the mission in her own home?
Around her kitchen table in the townships, she sparked a new house mission movement. They destroyed the building, but they couldn't destroy the network.
The kitchen table mentorship is really the engine of the whole thing. Estelle Phillips in Fresno proves that.
Estelle survived years of hardship because of her husband Cliff's heavy drinking. But after they convert, they start the Fresno Rescue Mission.
Estelle ran the women's work. And she didn't just do it alone. She actively mentored Pauline Pretzer.
Passing the baton. This proves Titus II. The biblical mandate of older women training younger women was the operational engine of the movement's expansion. Pauline eventually went on to found the Evangel Home,
which expands the network even further.
But this raises a really critical question for the listener today. In our current era of highly sanitized corporate nonprofits, have we lost the raw, relational, kitchen table mentorship that women like Estelle and Susan provided?
It's a great question. We often professionalize the humanity right out of the work. Right. But I also want to challenge the toxic idea of like burnout for God.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we look at these women and think they were invincible martyrs. But the text brings up Mabel Eberhart.
That is such a sobering story.
It really is. She had a miscarriage while carrying a heavy Christmas basket up some tenement stairs. And lying in the hospital, she realized she had to prioritize her own children over the endless demands of the mission.
She learned the hard way that you must balance boundless compassion with actual physical boundaries.
You can't save the city if you destroy your own family in the process.
And it was a daily, agonizing act of endurance. There's that vivid image of Estelle Phillips stressed about money, and her husband Cliff forces her to pull the car over.
So they could kneel in the dirt beside the road and pray for her to have more faith.
Just to get through the week.
So as we wrap up, let's briefly recap this journey. We went from Frances Naismith in the soot of Scotland to Maria McCauley in the subcellars of New York,
to Beulah Bulkley in the brothels of Kansas City, and Susan Benjamin in the bulldozed townships of South Africa.
And the common thread weaving through all of it is this relentless incarnational love.
Yes.
So whether you are prepping for a corporate meeting, leading a team, or just trying to navigate your community, the tactical lesson here is about seeing the invisible people around you.
And using what you have.
Exactly. Leveraging whatever you possess, whether that's wealth like Emma Whitmore, a teaching degree like Clem Ellis White, a kitchen table, or just a listening ear to bring light into dark places.
And drawing on the text's overarching theme, I want to leave you with a final thought. The history of city missions proves an astonishing principle. Those who are the problem become the solution. Look at the people in your own city, your workplace, or your family whom society has written off as the problem. What if they are actually the future leaders, just waiting for someone to sit next to them, look them in the eye, and offer them a helping hand?